not going to happen without heart and soul and spiritual connections to land. And it was on the banks of the river last March, I met someone who understands the connection to the land and the importance of that to the future of conservation. And that's our next speaker, Lydia Parker, who is from the Walker Mohawk Band of Six Nations of the Grand River. She is the executive director of Hunters of Color, a racial equity nonprofit working to create equitable opportunities for people of color to participate in hunting and conservation. Lydia will be doing some storytelling, discussing traditional ecological knowledge and the relationship with the land. And that's important. When people experience the land, experience the water, experience the fish, experience the wildlife, they become passionate. They become you, professionals that are committing your career to this work. And so Lydia's work to inspire people to get out there and enjoy this resource is vitally important. I'm really pleased to introduce Lydia, bring her here to the stage, and give her that opportunity to tell that story.
All right, is this one on and that one off? No screech owls, microphones? Okay, very good. Sego Sewakwego. Welcome to Lydia on Cuts. Hi everyone, my name is Lydia, as Gordon just said. I'm from the Walker Mohawk Band of the Six Nations of the Grand River, the Ganyan Kayaka, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. You can just say Mohawk. I'm also the executive director of Hunters of Color, as Gordon mentioned, and one of the founders as well. And I sit on the Department of the Interior's Hunting and Wildlife Conservation Council. I'm honored to be here today. Thank you to the Wildlife Council, or the Wildlife Society, for having me. Ed and Gordon, thank you for having me. And Yawangoa, thank you very much to my Spokane relatives for hosting us and being gracious hosts on this land that is yours. And greetings to everyone in attendance. It makes me so happy to see so many beautiful, vibrant faces here today. I'd like to start off in a good way with the Mohawk opening address. And I'm supposed to have slides. There we go. I'd like to lead us in the short Thanksgiving address for a few reasons. One, because it's how Haudenosaunee have been starting gatherings since time immemorial. And it's also something that, Mohawk Elder Tom Porter once shared with me, that when you have something good to share, share it. So I'd like to set our intentions for the rest of this conference through giving gratitude today. I'll be speaking in Ganyanka, and English translation is here behind me. Te tinu waradune onko soa. Te tinu waradune yekisan hanja. Te tinu waradune onega soa. Tunu duha te wanona. Te tinu waradune gonjo soa. Te tinu waradune gahi soa. Te tinu waradune onde soa. Tunu duha te wanona. Te tinu waradune gaya tosela. Te tinu waradune onde rio. Te tinu waradune oguela soa. Tunu duha te wanona. Dochidenu waradune sunque zuna. Tunu duha te wanona. Thank you for joining me in giving gratitude. I also share this address because it shows where I'm coming from as it pertains to wildlife, as it pertains to nature. And more importantly, I believe that this opening address shares something that's ubiquitous amongst Indian country. This idea of reverence and respect and relationship for all that Mother Earth has given us and all that we must do to take care of her in return. So I'm here today because I love Hunters of Color. I think that's why I got the initial invite. But I'm secretly here today to tell you some stories. I heard that you all like animals and I like storytelling. So I've got some stories about native ungulates that I'll share throughout the rest of this presentation. So let's dive into story time. So my first story comes from when I was a freshman in college at Oregon State University. I was moving into the dorms. I'd never met my roommate before. It was one of those random roommate selections that the university provided. And when I met her, I met this 18-year-old girl who grew up in downtown Seattle. I'm talking downtown Seattle. Concrete, shopping malls, prom at the Space Needle, downtown Seattle, Bainbridge Island, etc., etc. And I didn't know what to do with this girl because I did not grow up near the Space Needle. I grew up in a near city. And I decided the best thing I could possibly do was to take her fishing. It ended up being a mistake, as you can probably tell. But we're in the car, we're driving to this honey hole I was really excited to take her to, and going down this beautiful gravel road in the Willamette Valley, and some farmland, and all of a sudden, as I'm driving, she goes, "Wait, stop the car." And so my heart starts pounding, and I slam on the brakes, and I'm like, what? And she goes, "Look, a deer." I've never seen one except for in a zoo. And it broke my heart. And I also laughed out loud at her. So that's story number one. Story number two, through the work that I do with Hunters of Color, I was able to go down to the Bay Area to visit some post-Miwok relatives who are elk protectors, land and water protectors, working on preserving and protecting the Tule elk population at Point Reyes National Seashore. And seeing some nods, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Tule elk. We do have a picture of this as well, so I'm going to get that in a minute. Teresa Haaland, who is Kewa and who's Pueblo and Coast Miwok by adoption, and her partner Tiger are leading the fight in protecting the Tule elk and restoring some of their natural habitat and their population. And on the right, you can see one of the Tule elk that I took a picture of through Tiger brought a spotting scope, so it's through, you can kind of tell it's through a scope. It was really hard, but that was the only picture I got. But anyways, we're down at Point Reyes National Seashore. It's a beautiful sunny day. The sky is blue. It's super green because it had rained recently. And because it's the Bay Area, not only is it a beautiful sunny day, but it's also an awful cold windy day because that's how it is in the Bay Area. Second phone. Mid-precision, okay. Little background music never hurt. But I'm sitting here with Teresa and Tiger and my partner Jimmy, and we're waiting for the elk in the wind. I put 3 other layers on, and all of a sudden, this tiny, scrawny little cow elk comes cresting over the rise, and Teresa's face lights up. Another little scrawny cow comes cresting over the rise, and another. One who looks pregnant, which is just so exciting for all of us. And then finally a little fork comes over the hill. And Teresa's face lights up, and she goes, "Hello, my relatives." To Teresa, it wasn't just seeing the elk that made her excited. It wasn't just seeing a pregnant elk that made her excited. It was seeing a family member. It was seeing a pregnant family member, the joy of knowing that there's new life coming to your family. And to her, the plight of the Tule elk is more than any of us can understand. I'm sure that many of us are familiar with the Tule elk population that once was some 500 head strong and spread all the way from the coast to the Sierras, and now has dwindled to some 5,000 total in the wild today. Now the Tule elk and the dwindling of their population is heartbreaking, and as any of you know, I don't have to tell you, it's also detrimental to the ecosystems and to the habitats. But more than that, because they're family members of the Coast Miwok and the other tribes that have lived with them since time immemorial and been in relationship with them, the loss of these species is like losing a family member over and over and over and over again. And Teresa's joy, juxtaposed with that knowledge, made me want to do whatever we could do to help fight for the Tule elk, who are currently facing drought, lack of food, and Janus disease being spread from the ranching that's happening at Point Reyes National Seashore. And I share this story about Teresa, and I'm reminded of DR and Carol Nyankoa for both of your presentations. and what it means to be in relationship with one of these key species. And I share the first story of my roommate, whatever the hell that was, next to and juxtaposed with these stories, this idea of reverence and relationship with these animals. Because I believe that that is how it is supposed to be. And I'm afraid that we're moving every day more and more towards the concrete, towards the space needles, and away from nature, away from the elk, and away from right relationship and our connection with nature through playing an active role in the ecology. And that truly scares me. But I do believe also that we're at a crossroads, and we could go one of two ways. We could continue to disconnect, or we can ensure a bright future for our planet by embracing one another and the past. To explain what I mean by that, I'm going to quote another Haudenosaunee, the late great comedian Charlie Hill. Charlie said, "I always say that we as Indigenous people have the answers to fix what is wrong on this continent. After all, we have the owner's manual." Charlie's insight here, while comical, is also true. And one of my most esteemed colleagues and Wyandotte brothers, Latina Sami, has produced much research into the ways that Indigenous communities have stewarded this land since time immemorial. Whether we're talking about kelp forests and otter habitats, wolves, caribou, or prescribed burns to create edge habitat and thriving oak savanna, traditional ecological knowledge, or perhaps more correctly called Indigenous science or Indigenous-led conservation, has been successful, and that success is undeniable. And yet, I don't believe that Indigenous communities have been fully empowered to embrace the sovereignty that we are supposed to have over this land. I don't believe that we've been entrusted to govern this land that we've lived with and loved since time immemorial. I'm reminded of this truth every summer here on the West Coast as we continue to feel the growing impacts of forest fires. For that reason, I'm working with the DOI and others to continue to show that we don't need fancy tools or fancy words like dendrochronology to show you that Indigenous stewardship of the land that we've been doing for thousands of years truly works, and that Indigenous sovereignty and leadership is the way of the future. One of my favorite authors and Washington-based Indigenous scientist named Dr. Jessica Hernandez made a poignant observation in her recent book, Fresh Banana Leaves, when she said, "You'd be hard-pressed to find any Indigenous language with a traditional word for the Western modern idea of conservation." Why? Because we simply didn't need a word that means what we call conservation today. We didn't need to fix anything that had been done for clearing the land for civilization or for the sake of capitalism and market hunting. Instead, Dr. Hernandez refers to these ancient practices of stewardship not as conservation, but as healing. Healing for the land and in turn for the people. I'm going to go back to my slides here to show you what I mean when I'm talking about healing and what needs healing. I'm going to show you two maps to demonstrate what needs to be healed. And I'm sure that many of you have seen this map or a similar one that represents historic elk range and habitat versus current elk range. And when I first saw this map, I couldn't help but think of this map. And if it's hard to read, I'm not sure if the font's big enough in the back, but this map is Indigenous land loss post-1778. They're eerily similar, no? And I share this not only with sadness and mourning for what's been lost, but mostly because I have hope. Hope for the future and hope for wildlife. And I hope that we can restore a right relationship with the earth, and I'm not referring to some kind of ghost dance dream, but instead to healing that we can accomplish together, all of us as one. My elders taught me that we take care of the earth and she takes care of us, not because she has to, but because she is our mother, our mother the earth. And we care for her because we love her, not because we have to. That's why I co-founded Hunters of Color. Not because the nonprofit life is glamorous, but because I saw this Indigenous removal app and I saw the elk habitat loss map. And I recognized the connection between Indigenous peoples and Indigenous creatures. You see. All of us in this room are well aware of what happens when a critical species is extirpated from its natural habitat, especially a species that is endemic to a certain landmass, much like we as Indigenous peoples are endemic to this land. Beyond even just Indigenous peoples and our presence in the land, however, I founded Hunters of Color for another overwhelming reason. Because according to the most recent demographic study from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, less than 4% of all hunters identify as people of color. And as hunting contributes around $1.6 billion a year to conservation, and as our nation becomes more and more diverse, clearly this poses a problem. But more importantly than that, I founded Hunters of Color because we as Black, Indigenous people of color, as BIPOC, as people of color, whatever you want to call us, deserve every right to access the outdoors in all the ways that our white counterparts are able to. And more even than that, we founded Hunters of Color because I know that conservation and the future of our planet is going to take every single one of our brains, all of us, from all walks of life, from all political, religious, what have you, affiliations, coming together for the sake of our planet. We founded Hunters of Color in 2019 and incorporated as a nonprofit in 2020 in Oregon. And since then, we've expanded into 12 states as our mentorship program continues to make pathways to the outdoors for people of color all over the country. Hunters of Color is actively teaching people to love nature by showing how to play a role in the ecology and therefore how to harvest sustainable food for your families, to be able to have food sovereignty, to choose to harvest meat that means something to you rather than just going and buying factory farm meat at a grocery store. It also is allowing people to reconnect to ancestral heritage. All of our ancestors were hunters at one point. I mean, all of them. I mean, otherwise none of us would be in this room today. They were hunters and they were damn good hunters. And I also founded Hunters of Color for a more personal reason, because of the personal connection that I feel to nature and to animals and to this idea of right relationship, where you don't take too much, but you give and you take as a reciprocity and relationship with nature. I'm in a group of educators, other Haudenosaunee and Mohawk educators, and recently a colleague brought in some flip-knap arrowheads from Haudenosaunee and Mohawk land in the eastern part of New York State. And those arrowheads have been dated to 5,000 years old. And so when I think about my roots in this land, in Turtle Island, and hunting, and being in a relationship with these animals in that way, playing a role in the ecology in that way, that ancient practice and connection runs deep. And I think that can help explain this next story that I'm about to tell you. Last story. We were elk hunting about 3 years ago on Silette's land, the coastal range of Oregon. And I had a late night the night before, decided not to get up for first light with my partner Jimmy and his hunting buddy Reese. But in the night, I had a dream. And in that dream, there were these big, beautiful Roosevelt bulls tumbling down a cliff. And it was interesting enough, and I don't usually dream about elk, I don't usually dream in general, so it was interesting enough that when I woke up around first light, when the guys were getting up and getting ready to head out, I said, "Hey Jimmy, this sounds crazy, but look for a cliff. I think that's where you'll find your elk." And so they headed out on mountain bikes. which, by the way, if you're ever elk hunting and you have that much incline, that is a really good way to go. But they headed out on mountain bikes. And they were gone for a while. I stayed by the stream and hung out with our hunting dog, Rusty, and picked some blackberries. And they were gone for a while longer. And anyone who hunts knows that that's usually a pretty good sign if someone's gone that long. So after a bit, I hear, "Lydia!" And I look back and Jimmy's walking towards me, exhausted. I ran to grab him a Pedialyte and a beer. And he goes, "Lydia, you weren't right." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he proceeded to tell me a story about he's behind his buddy on his mountain bike, which is like pretty brand new, so it was like still squeaky, you know, when you like stopped, like the brakes were still squeaky. And so his buddy's in front of him, and his buddy puts up the halt sign. And Jimmy goes to halt and squeezes his brakes. It squeaks super loud. And not 50 yards in front of them, there's a beautiful bull elk grazing. And he heard the squeak, and Jimmy was like, "Oh no, these damn brakes." But he didn't move. He heard the squeak, he looked around and continued to graze. And so Jimmy was able to harvest that animal, and my family has been able to eat what we call hunter-tarian. It's really just a good way, traditional way, of eating this clean, sustainable meat, and we know where it comes from. But when Jimmy took the shot and went to go harvest the animal, or went to go say thank you to the animal for giving its life so that our family would have sustenance, he walked down, as he usually does, to put his hand on the elk to say thank you. And as he went down like this, the elk started to slide down this cliff. And I have a picture here to show you. The elk started to slide down a cliff. It's kind of hard to tell how steep it is. I guess you can see some ferns down the very bottom. But you're all familiar with how big these bull elks are, and you can kind of see his hindquarters look very small here. They weren't. That's how steep it was. And if the elk's antlers hadn't caught on a branch, it would have slid all the way down about 500 feet to the bottom of this ravine. And the pack out would have been horrible, impossible, and a lot of meat probably would have been lost that day if it weren't or because of the sun. But the antlers actually caught on some branches as it slid down, and Jimmy was able to run down, and clearly, as you can see, he tied his antlers to a tree because of how steep that cliff was. So anyways, after that happened, and I was like, wow, that's never happened before, it really did feel like Creator or my ancestors, somebody told us where we could harvest that food. And the more I think about it, the more I'm like, Creator, can you send me a dream with elk that are like 500-yard visibility on like some plateau? And I don't share these stories to try to convince everyone to become a hunter. I don't share these stories to try to get you all to donate to Hunters of Color, unless you really want to, but no, just kidding. I share these stories because I believe that this is what healing looks like, and right relationship with our animal kin and the planet. This planet that we call home. It's indigenous sovereignty and animal and human relationships that are both so important for wildlife management and for us, for our hearts and our souls. I also share these stories because I'm inspired by all of you and your decisions to be in relationship with the earth and with wildlife through your chosen career paths. Thank you all for being here today and for continuing to do the important work that you do. Whatever struggles or hardships you face to get here, I see you. It's not easy, and I'm so proud of you all for being here. You are making an impact on the future of wildlife conservation and the animals and places that we love. And I continue to mention the future because I see that future here today. The future of wildlife conservation is young. It is queer, it is brown, it is rooted in Black liberation and indigenous sovereignty. It's the people who historically have not been invited to the table that will be the ones to rebuild it. To end my ramblings, I'll leave you with the motto for my nonprofit Hunters of Color: the outdoors are for everyone. Namakoa, thank you very much for having me.